I wasn't scared or anything.
Hey, you did the right thing. You stood up to him. Yes.
Three's Company wasn't just a hit. It was a cultural landmark and a sitcom that defined an era with its charm, chemistry, and comedy. But behind the laughter and the perfectly timed entrances, not everything was as polished as it looked. Off-camera, tensions simmered, relationships fractured, and the careers of some cast members were changed forever. Still, what might surprise you even more isn't the drama backstage. It's what made it into the final cuts. From continuity slip-ups to unexpected cameos and a shocking on-air wardrobe malfunction, this show has some interesting bloopers hidden in plain sight, and once you see them, you'll never unsee them. The making of a classic. Every iconic sitcom has a story behind its creation, and Three's Company is no exception. Before it became one of the most talked about and beloved television shows of the late 1970s and early 80s, it was simply an idea imported from across the Atlantic. The show's beginnings were rooted in British television, where a sitcom called Man About the House had achieved notable popularity. American producers saw potential in the format of a man sharing an apartment with two women and believed it could be adapted for American audiences with the right tone and cast. What followed was a unique combination of luck, creativity, and precise casting decisions that turned a simple premise into a cultural phenomenon. The United States adaptation of Man About the House was developed by three seasoned television producers, Don Nicole, Michael Ross, and Bernie West. This trio wasn't new to television success. All three had previously worked together on groundbreaking American sitcoms like All in the Family and The Jeffersons, which were known for tackling social issues through comedy. With Three's Company, however, their objective was different. They weren't aiming to provoke thought or challenge norms in the same way. Instead, they wanted a lighthearted, accessible comedy that played with misunderstandings and exaggerated personalities, all within a simple and familiar domestic setting. The first major challenge was casting. The dynamic between the three main characters, who would share a two-bedroom apartment, was the heart of the story. And finding the right actors to bring those roles to life would determine whether the show succeeded or failed. The casting team saw many actors, tested different combinations, and even filmed multiple pilot episodes before finally finding the right balance. John Ritter was cast as Jack Tripper, the character who would become the comedic center of the series. Ritter was already gaining attention in television circles and came from a strong acting background, as he was the son of Tex Ritter, a well-known country singer and actor. John's ability to blend physical comedy with a kind of understated charm made him a natural fit. He wasn't just funny, he was also believable, and someone audiences could root for as he stumbled his way through a series of ridiculous misunderstandings and romantic mishaps. Then came Joyce DeWitt, who was cast as Janet Wood, one of Jack's roommates. DeWitt brought a grounded and pragmatic energy to the show. Her character was smart, level-headed, and often the voice of reason when Jack and their third roommate, Chrissy, veered off into absurdity. DeWitt's background in stage acting gave her a natural command over timing and dialogue, and her chemistry with Ritter was immediate and undeniable. Together they formed a solid comedic foundation, but the final piece of the puzzle was still missing. Initially, several actresses were considered for the role of Chrissy Snow, the naive and bubbly blonde. Among those tested were Suze Lanier-Bramlett and Susan Lanier, but their performances didn't quite match the energy or tone the producers were aiming for. In a surprising turn of events, Suzanne Summers was brought in at the last minute. She had previously done some modeling and smaller roles in film and TV, but her performance as Chrissy instantly caught the producers' attention. Summers brought a mix of warmth, comedic timing, and a natural innocence that turned what could have been a one-dimensional character into someone audiences genuinely loved. Despite joining the cast under a cloud of uncertainty, she quickly proved to be the breakout star of the show's early years. With the trio in place, the pilot was approved, and Three's Company officially debuted on March 15, 1977. The premise was simple but effective. Jack pretended to be gay so that the landlord would allow him to live with two women, an arrangement considered unconventional at the time. While the show's plot might seem tame by today's standards, it was considered daring when it first aired. Still, the humor was never crude. Instead, it relied more on misunderstandings, double entendres, and farcical setups than anything explicit. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Audiences loved the chemistry between the characters, the funny misunderstandings, and the simple yet effective setups. Within weeks, Three's Company climbed the ratings charts, becoming one of the most watched shows on television. By the end of its first season, it had become a cultural talking point, and the momentum only grew from there. As the seasons progressed, the show became known for its tight writing, well-timed physical comedy, and iconic moments that were both innocent and hilariously awkward. The show stayed in the top 10 for 6 consecutive years, from 1977 through 1983, a testament to both its popularity and its consistency. Viewers tuned in week after week to watch Jack fall over furniture, Chrissy misunderstand the simplest phrases, and Janet try to hold everything together. But its success wasn't limited to just viewership ratings. Three's Company also influenced the broader landscape of television. It normalized more progressive cohabitation themes, and it proved that American audiences were willing to embrace adaptations of British series when done right. And, just as important, it also launched the careers of its stars into household name territory, particularly John Ritter and Suzanne Somers. The show's success even extended into spin-offs. The first was The Ropers, which focused on the landlords Stanley and Helen Roper, played by Norman Fell and Audra Lindley. Although this series didn't achieve the same level of cultural impact as the original, it did gain a following and further demonstrated the popularity of the show's universe. By the time Three's Company ended in 1984, it had produced over 172 episodes over 8 seasons. It had won a Primetime Emmy Award and multiple People's Choice Awards, and left a lasting impression on American comedy television. Reruns of the show continued for decades, keeping it alive for new generations and reminding longtime fans of just how unique and entertaining the series really was. But while the laughs on Three's Company came easy for viewers, what happened behind the scenes was anything but lighthearted. For a show built on chemistry and charm, the off-camera reality was far more complicated. The fame brought tension, success came with a cost, and not every relationship survived what happened when the cameras stopped rolling. Behind-the-scenes tensions. By its 3rd season, Three's Company had become one of the most popular shows on television. The cast were household names, the ratings were sky-high, and everything seemed to be working. But by 1980, things started to unravel, and it all began with a contract dispute that would change the course of the show and the lives of its stars forever. Suzanne Somers, who played the iconic role of Chrissy Snow, had quickly become one of the show's most recognizable faces. Her portrayal of the lovable, ditzy blonde had not only earned laughs, but also turned her into a breakout star. Yet, while Three's Company thrived, Somers quietly grew frustrated with the pay gap between herself and her co-star John Ritter. At the time, Somers was earning $30,000 per episode, while Ritter was being paid around $150,000. In 1980, with her contract up for renewal, Somers made a bold move. Backed by her then-husband and manager Alan Hamill, she asked ABC for pay parity. She wanted to earn the same amount as Ritter, not more, not less. According to Somers, the issue wasn't about greed. She believed it was a matter of fairness, especially given her popularity and the revenue the show was generating. But ABC saw the demand differently, and they responded in a way Somers would never have predicted. In fact, rather than renegotiate, they offered Somers a modest raise, but nowhere near what she'd requested, and when she continued to push back, the studio retaliated. Her role was reduced to brief appearances, which was a quiet but very public demotion that signaled the beginning of the end. Eventually, Somers was fired. In her place, producers brought in Jenna Lee Harrison as Chrissy's clumsy cousin, Cindy Snow. Later, Priscilla Barnes was added as the more mature and level-headed Terry Alden. Though both actresses gave solid performances, the dynamic had shifted. The original magic and electricity between Ritter, DeWitt, and Somers was gone, and the audiences noticed. But the fallout didn't just affect the storyline, it deeply impacted the relationships between the actors, especially between Suzanne Somers and John Ritter. In interviews years later, Somers shared that Ritter was deeply hurt by the contract dispute and what he perceived as a betrayal to the ensemble. Ritter reportedly refused to speak with her after she was fired, and for many years, their relationship was strained. While Summers maintained that her fight was about principle, not ego, Ritter's perspective was more personal. He valued the show's unity and saw the dispute as a disruption of that bond. It wasn't until much later that the two finally reconciled. Summers recalled a moment when Ritter unexpectedly reached out, and the two shared a warm phone call that finally cleared the air. As for Joyce DeWitt, she managed to avoid much of the spotlight after the show ended, keeping a relatively low profile. But she, too, had her own struggles. In 2009, nearly 25 years after Three's Company had wrapped, DeWitt was arrested for driving under the influence in California, and the incident brought her briefly back into headlines. She took responsibility, completed a sentence that included probation and community service, and then continued to live mostly outside of the public eye. Sadly, the most heartbreaking part of the show's legacy would be the unexpected deaths of several of its beloved cast members. John Ritter's death in 2003 came as a shock to both fans and colleagues. At just 54 years old, Ritter was rushed to the hospital and initially misdiagnosed with a heart attack. Doctors later discovered he had suffered an aortic dissection, a rare and often fatal tear in the main artery of the heart. Despite emergency surgery, Ritter passed away that same evening. The loss was sudden and devastating, not just to his family, but to fans who had watched him for decades. Ritter was remembered not only for his comedic talent, but also for his kindness, humility, and generosity in real life. Suzanne Somers also faced a long health battle. She was first diagnosed with breast cancer in 2000 and underwent treatment that included surgery and alternative therapies. For many years, she remained cancer-free and became a vocal advocate for natural health and wellness. But in 2023, the cancer returned. On October 15, 2023, just one day before her 77th birthday, Somers passed away. Her family remembered her not only as a television star, but as a resilient and joyful woman who never stopped fighting. Other cast members from the show also passed on. Norman Fell, who played the grumpy but oddly lovable landlord Mr. Roper, died in 1998 after a battle with cancer. Audra Lindley, who portrayed his sharp-tongued but warm-hearted wife, Mrs. Roper, died 1 year earlier in 1997. The two were a highlight of the show's early seasons, and were later given their own spin-off, The Ropers. While the spin-off had limited success, Fell and Lindley's contributions to the world of Three's Company remained memorable and beloved. In many ways, the tragedies and tensions behind the scenes of Three's Company mirrored the emotional complexity of working in show business. What started as a lighthearted sitcom about misunderstandings and physical comedy slowly turned into a lesson in contracts, ego, loyalty, and loss. The laughter we saw on screen was real, but so was the cost that came with creating it. But while most people remember the big storylines and unforgettable characters, some of the most fascinating parts of Three's Company aren't even in the scripts at all. They happened by accident, were caught on camera, and left in the final cut. Here are some of the bloopers you were never supposed to notice on Three's Company. One scene in particular has left viewers confused to this day. Bloopers you never noticed. For a show known for its tight comedic timing and slick production, Three's Company still had its fair share of goofs, and some of them weren't even caught until the episodes had already aired. In an era before high-definition televisions, most of these bloopers slip past the viewers, but watch closely now, and you'll start spotting things you were never meant to see. One of the most common slip-ups involved the visibility of crew members and production equipment. In multiple episodes, if you pay attention to the edges of the frame, or what's happening just behind the characters, you'll notice unintended appearances by boom mics, set crew, and shifting props. A particularly well-documented example comes from the episode titled Stanley's Hotline. At one point in the scene, while Mr. Roper is talking, a boom mic briefly dips into the top of the frame. And to make matters worse, it lingers long enough to raise eyebrows. Behind him, you can even spot a crew member moving in the shadows of the set, a rare breach of the sitcom's usually polished fourth wall. Another notable moment in the same episode involves a set of bright yellow cans placed on a shelf in the background. In one shot, they're just 2 cans. But in the very next shot, just seconds later, we're shown just 1 can, and it appears as if someone moved them between takes. But then, in the following cut, they're back to 2 cans again. The change is small, but once you notice it, it's impossible to unsee. It's a clear example of a continuity error, one of the most frequent issues in multi-camera sitcoms filmed over several days with repeated takes. These kinds of mistakes were fairly common during the show's run. In many other episodes, cables can be seen snaking along the floor near doors that characters enter and exit from. Lighting equipment occasionally casts shadows that don't belong to any of the characters, subtly betraying the presence of rigs just out of view. Even the seams of the set itself sometimes break the illusion. But perhaps what's most surprising is that these mistakes weren't edited out. Today, a show might simply reshoot the scene or crop the frame. But in the late 70s and early 80s, editing technology was limited and expensive. If the performances were strong and the audience laughed in the right places, a visible mic or continuity error wasn't enough to scrap the scene. Producers often chose to leave it in, and many of those choices became part of the show's charm. But not every blooper was tucked away in the background. Some played out right in the middle of the action so clearly that it's hard to believe they weren't caught in editing. One dance scene in particular left audiences scratching their heads, wondering whether they just saw something go hilariously off-script. The toupee that wouldn't fly. Of all the bloopers embedded in Three's Company, few are as unintentionally funny or awkward as the infamous toupee scene. It wasn't just a background slip or a continuity issue. This was a physical gag gone wrong in the middle of a carefully choreographed moment. The moment in question appears during dance scenes, featured in episodes like Ground Rules and Chrissy's Cousin. In one of these scenes, there's a lighthearted dance sequence where the script calls for a little old lady to whirl past the dance floor and dramatically yank a toupee off the head of an unsuspecting man as she spins by. It's supposed to be one of those super quick moments that add a bit of extra humor without distracting from the main story. However, that's not quite how it plays out. On camera, you can clearly see the elderly dancer miss her cue. She spins past the man, reaches for the toupee, and misses. Her hand brushes his head, but the wig stays firmly in place. For a split second, there's a beat of hesitation, as if she realizes the stunt didn't work. Then, instead of continuing the dance or trying to cover it up, she stops, turns back around, and deliberately grabs the toupee off his head by hand. The result is a moment that feels both awkward and oddly genuine. You can almost see the gears turning in her mind as she tries to salvage the scene that we obviously improvised and hilariously unpolished. And yet, it wasn't reshot. The footage made it into the final cut, and audiences watching carefully today can still spot the whole thing unfold. This blooper is especially notable because Three's Company was a show that prided itself on physical comedy. John Ritter was a master of the genre, often falling over couches or walking into doors with the grace of a trained slapstick actor. Timing and body language were critical to the humor, so when the toupee trick fell apart so visibly and was left untouched, it stood out. What makes the moment even more surprising is how easily it could have been fixed. The dance scene wasn't live. It was pre-recorded like most episodes. There was time to redo the shot or cut around the error. But for reasons unknown, it remained untouched. And so viewers today are left with a unique little time capsule of what happens when comedy choreography doesn't quite go to plan. But what happens when a mistake is so strange and so oddly timed that viewers wonder if it was even a mistake at all? For decades, Three's Company fans have dissected this blooper, and once you see it, you'll never unsee it. The short's malfunction. As polished and rehearsed as sitcoms often appear, live-action filming brings inevitable surprises, and some of them slip through the cracks. In the case of Three's Company, one blooper involving John Ritter didn't just catch the crew off guard, it left network censors scrambling years later. The moment in question involves an episode that originally aired without any major issue. But during a syndicated rerun broadcast, viewers spotted something that hadn't been as noticeable in earlier airings. In a scene where Jack Tripper, played by John Ritter, is casually lounging around in short gym attire, there's a brief shot where his shorts unintentionally reveal more than expected. The moment happens quickly. Ritter is shifting positions on a couch, talking to one of the female characters in the scene, when a wardrobe slip happens. This incident went unnoticed by the editors at the time, especially in the era before high-resolution playback and digital freeze framing. But viewers in the early 2000s watching late-night reruns with sharper televisions and the ability to pause scenes, noticed. The scene began generating quiet buzz online, mostly on message boards and forums where fans discussed strange and surprising TV moments. Once word reached the network, the episode was edited and the problematic moment was removed in later airings. The scene was trimmed just enough to remove the offending frame while preserving the original dialogue and flow. The moment was never acknowledged officially by the network, but fans who remembered the original version noticed the difference right away. Interestingly, John Ritter himself was made aware of the blooper years later during an interview. Rather than being embarrassed, he took the revelation in stride, reportedly laughing about it and joking that it was no big deal. But to this day, the blooper has taken on a kind of legend among devoted fans. While it was a simple wardrobe mishap, it became one of the most widely discussed syndication edits in sitcom history, not because of its severity, but because it reflected how even the most professional productions can't account for every accidental slip. And speaking of unexpected appearances, one of the show's most charming and unscripted moments came when a familiar face who wasn't in the cast list popped up in the background. A son sneaks on set. Among the sea of carefully staged scenes and scripted laughs in Three's Company, there's one blooper that stands out not because it was embarrassing, but because it was surprisingly heartwarming and completely unplanned. In a later season episode featuring a scene at the zoo, the camera briefly pans across a group of people walking in the background, while the main characters carry on a conversation in the foreground. At first glance, it looks like any other bit of background activity meant to make the scene feel real, but sharp-eyed viewers, especially those familiar with John Ritter's life, noticed something unusual. Among the passers-by is a young boy who ran up to one of the main characters. That boy, as it turns out, was Jason Ritter, John Ritter's real-life son. At the time, Jason wasn't an actor. He was simply visiting his father on set that day. The production crew was filming on location for a zoo segment, and like many children would be, Jason was curious and wandered into the general filming area. While the scene was rolling, he ended up running directly into the background, completely unscripted and unnoticed by most of the crew. What makes this moment even better is Joyce DeWitt's reaction. According to behind-the-scenes accounts, she noticed Jason in the corner of her eye during the take and couldn't help but break into a subtle smile mid-scene. And so, rather than cut or reshoot the scene, producers decided to leave it in. There was no harm done. And in fact, the accidental cameo added a charming layer to the episode. It was a moment that reminded viewers, even unconsciously, that the people behind these characters were also real families, with lives and loved ones just beyond the frame. Jason Ritter, of course, would go on to have a successful acting career of his own. He inherited much of his father's warmth and comedic timing, and that fleeting moment on Three's Company became a quiet footnote in his journey and his very first unofficial television appearance long before he ever booked a role. But there's more, because one scene in Three's Company still has viewers talking to this day: the walkway that didn't go anywhere. One of the more subtle but persistent continuity errors in Three's Company doesn't involve a prop or a line or even a wardrobe malfunction. It involves the very layout of the apartment building itself. Specifically, the walkway just outside Jack, Janet, and Chrissy's front door. In the early seasons, the apartment's outdoor landing was designed as a dead end. When the camera followed a character outside, or when someone knocked on the door and the trio answered, it was clear from the set design that their unit was located at the end of the walkway. There was no visible path continuing beyond their front door, and no neighboring units in sight. The implication was clear. Theirs was the final apartment in that corner of the building. This layout was consistent for much of the show's original run and made practical sense for filming. With a single point of entry, the audience could always anticipate who was arriving and from where. It kept the geography of the set simple and familiar. But as the series expanded in later seasons, especially when new neighbors and guest characters were introduced, the exterior layout suddenly changed. Without any explanation or redesign within the storyline, the once dead-end walkway now extended visibly past their door. In several scenes, you can clearly see that the concrete path continues down the side of the building. Characters now enter from beyond the apartment, coming around the corner or disappearing into a hallway that never existed in the early episodes. This visual difference was obvious, especially to longtime viewers, but it was never addressed in the show's dialogue or plot. There was no mention of construction, renovation, or a magically appearing wing of the building. It was simply one of those set evolutions that happened quietly behind the scenes, and most likely for practical reasons. Producers likely wanted to increase filming flexibility and allow for more on-location moments. As recurring characters like neighbors became more involved, a single-direction walkway limited how naturally the space could be used. Extending it gave the impression of a fuller, more populated apartment complex. Still, for viewers who had grown accustomed to the cozy little corner at the end of the path, the new walkway raised a few eyebrows. It's a small but enduring inconsistency, one that once you notice, you'll always see. From unexpected cameos and unscripted laughs to wardrobe mishaps and architectural mysteries, Three's Company was never quite as squeaky clean as it seemed. And maybe that's part of why the show still resonates today. For all its tight scripts and perfect punchlines, it was still a very human production, filled with last-minute changes, minor oversights, and happy accidents. In the world of television, the goal is often to create the illusion of perfection. But as fans of Three's Company know, the magic wasn't in the polish, it was in the charm. And sometimes, that charm came from the moments no one planned. Did you notice any of these bloopers when you watched Three's Company? Tell us in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.